This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. War is the mother of all inventions, and how we enter a war is really how we leave it. In the beginning of the First World War, the French cavalry rode into battle in bright blue and red Napoleonic-style outfits, donned with long crests of hair. They were subsequently torn apart. And just 4 years later, at the end of that war, we were witnessing coordinated plane, tank, and artillery assaults, a direct precursor to the German blitzkriegs we'd see years later. In World War II, we would enter with these tiny tractor-like tanks, and biplanes still making up a large amount of many nations' air forces. And yet, 6 years later, we left with jet fighters, rockets, and nuclear weapons. And this is true even in a microcosm of that war. Even the Russians, who invaded Finland in 1939, left that conflict incredibly different to how they entered it. For the Russians, the war into Finland, or the Winter War, had a catastrophic first few months, losing columns of tanks and scores of men, and being pummeled by a nation they assumed would surrender in just a few days. As that Winter War dragged on and the Russians suffered defeat after defeat, the Russians would learn from their early mistakes in the Finnish War and would take these lessons learned in the cold forests around Lake Ladoga and use it to break the Germans years later. War is where the rubber meets the road, where academic theories actually get tested. And for some, it's a smug, I told you so moment. But for others, it forces them back to the drawing board. So when war reignited on the European continent in February, many observers would begin watching the war closely. Amongst the Russia and Ukraine expert community, there were some things they got right. After 2014, most experts were sure that the Ukrainians would not act passively like they had before, and upon invasion, would fight back. But there are also many things that people got wrong. There are very few who could have accurately predicted the international support given to Ukraine, and that if you were to travel to places as far away as Australia or South Africa, that there will be Slava Ukrainia bumper stickers all around town. The biggest miscalculation, though, I think, was on the cyber front. We had seen the Russians in just these last few years shut down pipelines in the US, take down power grids in Ukraine, and sow disinformation in elections throughout the West. We all assumed these were dress rehearsals for the big event being an invasion of Ukraine. So when the first videos came back to us on February 24th of the Russian troops advancing from Crimea into southern Ukraine, we were all braced for a devastating cyber attack, one that would send Ukraine back to the Stone Age. And we kept bracing, and bracing, and bracing, and then nothing. Nothing really happened. A couple of Ukrainian websites went down for a bit, and making calls to contacts in the ground was occasionally a bit annoying. But was that it? How was it that the great Russian cyber machine was doing less national damage than the average IT intern given admin privileges? So, what happened? Were the Russians bluffing this entire time? Were the Ukrainians just prepared to the nth waiting for this? Or is it that Russia is simply saving its cyber weapons for another moment? Well, that's the question we're going to be attempting to answer today. But before I get into it, I want to remind you that we always try and take a neutral tone here at the show, and we always try and put our own personal feelings about conflicts aside, and attempt to maintain journalistic objectivity at all times. And why I mention this is to get it on the record that in this piece we have got a senior commander of the Ukrainian Defense Force, and for integrity, we did make the same offer to his Russian equivalent, but unsurprisingly they declined the interview. But with that out the way, let's ask, why were our expectations of the Russian cyber forces so off the mark? Have we wildly overestimated the Russians, or is there more to this story? And to help us answer that, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. A test run for terror.
Cyber is a pretty important part of the Russian hybrid warfare inflicted against Ukraine. But maybe the main difference with 2014 is that Ukraine is much more prepared and actually learned from its mistakes and previous Russian attacks that actually hit pretty hard. Prior to the large-scale invasion on the February 24th, I would say that Russia again intensified its approach in attacking different parts of the Ukrainian cyber infrastructure, namely media, banking sphere, governmental websites. Russia tried pretty heavily to attack those establishments, but the results of these attacks were actually not that extremely successful, simply because Ukraine was kind of prepared, collaborated with partners 24/7, and identified those threats and mitigating them. We cannot say for sure that there were no successes from the Russian side. So namely the Viasat attack that actually provided some problems with the communication through the SATCOMs with troops in the front line. But again, it was mitigated.
Roman Osadchuk is Eurasia specialist at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Roman's research specializes in disinformation narratives and technology used throughout the region. He's also a specialist in information policy and the spread of disinformation. Prior to working at the DFR lab, he also held several positions inside the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
There were attacks on the Ukrainian infrastructure, like namely against Ukr-Telecom. It's Ukrainian largest provider of the internet comms. So on March 28th, if I remember correctly, they launched a cyber attack that actually was consisted of a few stages, but still the whole attack was mitigated within one day, and the next day almost all of the services were restored almost fully. So like in sum, it's still pretty important part of the hybrid warfare, but I would say that Ukraine is much more better prepared and suited for this kind of attacks, since there are a lot of institutions, actors, and companies are working in a concert to diminish the negative effects of such attacks, identifying them, explaining them, and debunking them.
So many expected Russia to plunge Ukraine into blackouts nationwide from day one, as well as put a fire hose of disinformation right across the country. That's what the Russian doctrinal books tell us they would do, and that's what we all expected them to do. In the end, though, very little of that actually took place, and not a lot of it was as effective as we thought it might be. So did Russia throw away their standard playbook for the first parts of the Ukraine campaign, or was Ukraine just more prepared for what was coming?
I mean, they are going pretty heavily. They are launching multiple attacks, phishing attempts with some malware attached. So like if you download the file, click on it, you will download some wiper or some kind of other malware, or actually providing access to your PowerShell and something like this. They are trying, but probably we are not having an impression that they are like extremely effective, or not given a lot of messages of them being successful with it, because I know there is nothing to report on, right? So media are not actually going into reporting their failed attempts and covering only maybe successful attempts, like with the Viasat or maybe Ukr-Telecom. But as I said, a lot of those attacks got actually identified and mitigated pretty quickly. And also another thing is that Ukraine implemented a few really critical things to actually protect its critical infrastructure, and switched it towards the cloud infrastructure, making it actually harder for the hackers, Russian hackers, to inflict damage on them. But as I said, they're trying and poking around, launching different attacks. Russians are trying hard, but again, the cooperation between different actors and some preparatory steps of switching the infrastructure to the cloud, and also moving some of the infrastructure to the outside of the zone of conflict, or where they could be inflicted by shelling or bombing. It's actually helping in making the life of Russian hackers harder in achieving their results.
We'll talk a bit more about the benefits of moving Ukrainian data to overseas servers a bit later, but for now I want to lay out the other side a little bit better as well, and that would mean talking about the GRU. As a rough equivalent, the US has Cyber Command, which sits underneath Army Command, and is usually used for these sorts of operations, whereas in Russia, the main actor in this theatre is the GRU, who roughly translated would be something like Chief Intelligence Office. The GRU, which focuses on disinformation and information and cyber warfare, as well as many other operations, has been responsible for the majority of state-sanctioned cyber attacks coming out from Russia. And after showing off their cyber capabilities in previous attacks on Ukraine and Estonia and the US, they were seen by many as a major Russian force. Some analysts even anointed them the title that they would be as effective as the tanks when a real war actually came to pass. In reality though, when the rubber hit the road, have they actually been the tip of the Russian spear? Or are they now really just taking a back seat to the Russian tank and artillery commanders?
GRU as Russian military as well, that being dubbed as the second largest and mighty armies in the world, air quotes. So we saw that actually what's there on the paper is not always actually corresponds with the reality. So it's not going without telling that they've conducted some really heavy attacks right in the past, so they are pretty harmful and they could inflict harm on different parts of the infrastructure. They could be extremely effective, but there is always a way to be at least somehow prepared to mitigate those attacks or identify them quick, and therefore not given a lot of the room for them to develop and make it even rougher, more dangerous attacks. So another thing here is that GRU probably is not an exception within the Russian whole military or intelligence branch of the Russian government that is heavily inflicted and impacted by corruption. So as we saw with Russian military equipment, when pilots stitching their regular GPS devices within the cockpit of their airplanes, or maintenance of their military equipment, and that actually been heavily impacted by the corruption. So I think in this specific case, it did not invest all of those money and all of those resources that they had into making their cyber capabilities and other capabilities more dangerous than they are in reality. Yeah, effective defense and corruption in Russian army. So it's still scary actor. They're still capable of a lot of things. But those two things are actually help to mitigate the risks and make it less dangerous than it is.
So the supporters of this war on either side are pretty transparent, and the US is openly supplying the Ukrainians with weapons and assistance. Even countries as far away as Australia are sending weapons and equipment into Ukraine. Yet the war in real fighting continues to maintain its geographical confinements for the most part. Yes, we are seeing Ukrainian missiles attacking Russian border cities like Belgorod, and yes, we are seeing Russia launching its attacks from Belarus's sovereign territory. But cyber-wise, both sides seem to be keeping a somewhat local doctrine, even with cyber being really hard to attribute and prove who did it. Ukraine doesn't seem to be trying to take down large-scale power grids inside Russia, and Russia isn't attacking US pipelines on a weekly basis inside America. So with cyber warfare being so hard to attribute, why are both sides seeming to limit the scope of their cyber activities to within the geographic confines of Ukraine?
Basically, as I said, the attribution is pretty hard, but you could guess from the patterns, right? So if the objective of the attack is, to inflict damage, but not to receive some kind of remuneration or some payment, right, to ransom, so you would probably kind of can guess that this whole kind of thing is being done to actually inflict some damage because of the ongoing war. There is definitely a way to find out that basically if some actions are actually helping one of the sides, it's logical thing to think that those attacks were inflicted by this side that's being benefiting from it. Also, there are a few things and history of different tools and approaches used by some actors. So the cyber threats, most of them in cyber attacks being actually documented and attributed to some specific groups, even though not always tied specifically to the government. It's the case actually with Russia that they are using some proxy groups that are not actually attributed directly to the government, but they're doing something in favor of the government. So I think in this specific case, Russian groups that are being doing a lot of things against Ukrainian infrastructure, and those attacks are being actually documented well. So if they coincide with the patterns of their behavior, and also some of the cyber attacks are actually coinciding with the kinetic warfare that Russia is inflicting against Ukraine. So basically, some of the attacks might actually coincide within a few days, with the actual shelling of a specific object.
A lot of analysts theorize that tools like Pegasus, an Israeli-designed cyber weapon that allows its user to get inside, record, and operate almost any smartphone anywhere in the world, would make a large impact in this particular conflict, particularly after Pegasus has been sold by the Israelis to somewhat Russia-friendly nations such as Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, and India. From what the open source material indicates at least, we haven't seen nearly the dramatic impact from these particular tools that many thought there would be. So can you take us through why Pegasus was speculated to be so impactful and the impact it's actually had on the conflict in practice?
So the Pegasus is the software. It's a specific software that's being installed without person consent or acknowledgement to the mobile device, and actually send a lot of data and provide full access to the phones remotely to the people who send this specific software to the target. So it was a huge scandal last year, I guess, when a lot of civil society activists, politicians found out that their devices were inflicted by this specific malware. So I think that this specific tool was not extremely useful in the war, simply because there are a lot of many other reconnaissance and surveillance types of system or tricks that any Russian side could use to spy on the military. So namely, these attacks, they are being targeted. So you need to know the phone number, you need to send at least an SMS message, and the person should click on it, and then the download will be there. So this is actually a few extra steps to infect the phones, and there are a number of different military and soldiers fighting on the front line, so it's not that effective. I mean, the GSM jamming, or just capturing the cell towers and understanding who is located where, and the usage of drones for the surveillance and reconnaissance, it's much more effective, and also sat imagery is much more effective than, let's say, basically using some time and high cost software with partial rate of success. So you need to be successful so that the person would click on link, then load it, and will have his or her phone actually powered on. So there's a lot of steps should be, and precautions should be made and taken into consideration to use the Pegasus, while you could use much more easier and more straightforward thing for the similar capabilities. Of course, you will not get the control over the communications through the WhatsApp and something like this. But when we are talking about the front line, I think that the internet connection there is not that powerful anyway. So the only exception is satellite comms, but that's rather the exclusion than the rule. So exception than the rule. It's much more easier to use the GSM towers to capture some calls, and actually it's been widely used by Ukrainian side for sure. Probably you've seen or heard that Ukrainian special forces actually capturing the GSM calls of Russian soldiers and occupiers to their relatives in Russia, and actually post them online so you could listen to them. While the Russian side is not doing this extensively and openly, you could probably safely think that they are definitely doing this, the similar things, trying to listen into the comms of Ukrainian side, and actually doing it much more in effective scale than it would be to trying to actually inflict the Pegasus into this specific case.
Russia still has the ability to roll out programs like this though, and many have speculated they already have, because the sad bit is that many wouldn't know if they already had the malware on their phone ready to go. And whilst yes, in most cases you would need someone to click a link or download something, let's go through a real example of how this sort of malware gets onto people's phones unsuspectingly. And as our example, let's talk about the Uyghur Chinese who come from Xinjiang and are now living abroad. Uyghur Chinese whose personal data is still of very great interest to the government back in Beijing. Most Uyghurs living abroad, though, are aware that Beijing is either trying to get into their phone or wants to look at things in their phone. And the vast majority of them are smart enough to not click any links or download anything they're not aware of. But investigations done a few years ago and reports released found that whilst China did send the standard phishing links of click here to win a prize, they also did things like embed their malware within most of the downloadable Uyghur language keyboards online. So if Uyghurs wanted to communicate with people back home in the Uyghur language, they had to download one of these keyboards that likely had the malware somewhere embedded in it. So as soon as that keyboard hits their phone, China had their data. So even if most Ukrainians and Russians are very confident they're too clever to click on a "you've won 1,000 rubles" link, there may be other ways that both Kiev and Moscow can get inside the communication devices being used on the front line. But for now, let's focus on the main two. Earlier on you mentioned cell towers, and we've been talking about malware. So how can countries use things like cell towers and malware to actually disrupt and impede communications of the opposing army? Can you actually walk us through the process?
The one who controls the cell tower is actually having like a lot of different information based on the different devices that are trying to connect to the specific cell tower. So our smartphones or mobile phones, they're like constantly connecting to those cell towers and sending different packets and trying to find the best signal out there. So basically, if you have 3 different cell towers in control and the phone is between them and trying to connect to the 3 of them at the same time, you could triangulate and kind of identify within a precision of a few meters the exact location of a specific user. So basically, if you see that there is probably a lot of different users in the one spot and they are using the comms and or connecting at a specific time of the day, or you see that there were now no users at a specific location, but then at some point there was 30, 50 at the same time, and they are popping there with a regular frequency, it might basically indicate probably that there are some people there. And again, you might probably we're using some other means of comms like drone surveillance and reconnaissance to confirm whether it's military or not. That's the one way to do it. Another one is basically when you get an access to the cell tower, you actually access most of the metadata being done by the users of the specific cell tower, meaning that when people are making calls or sending SMS messages, all of the metadata like the length of the call, whom this call was made to, and the same goes with the messages. They are actually pretty easily this data being collected and might be used to find some patterns, some regime of the day, so what people are doing and when they are doing. And again, if there is some kind of schedule, you could actually also guess there is probably some people that are really into the strict orders and basically schedule of the day, so basically soldiers. And finally, I think that you could even create some proxy GSM towers to catch and even probably intercept the calls and read the SMS messages that those folks are actually sending. Or if you wanna just to jam all of the connections, you could do on the opposite directions. You could actually bring in special hardware that would jam all of the signals. Or if they wanted to jam some walkie-talkies or portable shortwave radio comms, or you want to listen to them, if they're not encrypted, of course. So you could use, again, some systems to try to penetrate those communications and listen to them. As probably you've seen that some of the users are actually successful, and in March they even penetrated this radio comms of Russian troops, which proves the point that this is definitely possible, not only to listen to them to specific frequencies, but also to actually send some destructive messages that would interfere with the messages and make those comms harder, on top of just jamming them.
The cyber operations launched pre-war or even early war have been very different to what we're seeing being launched at the moment. So what developments do you see coming up in this theater as the war continues to drag along?
It's really hard to predict, But as of now, we're like 6 months into this large-scale invasion and more than 8 years into the war itself. And we could probably, if we're going retrospectively, we could say that Wilde the Cyber wasn't, the main player in all of this thing. So it was always second in the kinetic warfare. So it's probably would continue this way, but it doesn't mean that it becomes less dangerous or less destructive. So one attack like the NotPetya one could actually provide tons of and a lot of damages to the people and their systems and inflict severe damage. As for the Russian side, I think that probably they partially did not expect that it might take too long, their invasion. So a few different indicators suggest that they were preparing for something short, like Blitzkrieg in a few days, but it didn't happen. So it means that now they actually have to reinvent their tactics and use some other modes, or at least somewhat adapt to what's happening on the field. So I guess that we would see at least the same intensity of different attacks, so like a few attacks per month. So this will continue. They would try poking around, hoping to find some vulnerabilities and some cracks into defense to get, to use this advantage if they found some, to inflict some damages. A lot of people are afraid of actually fall and winter season, since experts predict that Russians would try to somehow disrupt the heating and gas distribution systems in Ukraine so that people would be freezing in their apartments. So maybe some of the attacks would be actually aimed at this infrastructure. So we'll see how it goes. It's hard to predict. Like, we cannot see the future, unfortunately.
Most of the media reporting from the front lines focuses on the tank battles and drone strikes, and the cyber front seems to go wildly underreported. Yet, there's a lot of ground that can be won or lost on this particular front. And here is where everyone from China to Iran are trying out new weapons under the anonymity of the cyber front. But there are some people following this front very closely, who have first-hand knowledge of the offences being carried out right under our nose. And to talk to us about that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Modems and Machine Guns.
Почнемо з того, що масовані кібератаки на українську інфраструктуру почалися.
We'll start with the fact that the massive cyber attacks started before Russia invaded in February this year. So we had one massive attack on the 14th of January, and then on the 15th of February 2022. And the goal of these attacks was to make the population panic and disrupt their trust to the state and make them believe that the state is not ready to face the enemy.
Brigadier General Yurii Shchyhol is head of the State Service of Special Communications and Information Protection for the nation of Ukraine, and the general in charge of the Ukrainians' information and cyber defences. He calls into us direct from the front lines and speaking through a translator, and we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
При цьому жодна з кібератак, яка була проведена.
I also want to note that the cyber attacks that happened before the war were not successful, and the enemy did not manage to steal data. They did manage to change a few web pages, but they were quickly restored to normal thanks to our partners. After the start of the war, the enemy tried to attack mobile providers such as Viasat Telecom, etc. And they tried to disrupt the access of the civilians to mobile network. When they would capture territory, they would they would immediately turn off the connection and try to physically destroy this mobile the stations that provided a connection, to deny the civilians the information on the ground and how Ukraine is fighting the enemy.
How important has the cyber front been to Ukraine's defense so far?
Тому це перша в історії війна, де
This is the first cyber warfare, and cyberspace is full battleground, and cyberspace is used as much as rockets and kinetic or means of kinetic warfare. And their main task was to destroy civilian infrastructure. And just like they try to destroy the objects of civilian infrastructure and make as much damage, inflict as much damage as possible to civilians, disrupting medical services and other critical life services in the cyberspace, they end up the same thing. Yeah.
The Russians launched a very effective cyber campaign against Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, taking down communications and power grids all across the country. A lot of analysts were assuming we'd see similar kinds of chaos in the opening stages of this new offensive. So how did the early attacks we saw in February this year compare to the cyber attacks Russia launched in 2014 or 2015?
Основною різницею є те, що в 2014-15
The main difference is that in 2014 and 2015, Ukraine was not ready for cyber warfare. And yes, the power grids, the power was out, and the virus that was used to do that was the same virus that was used in 2022, but a bit modified. And in 2022, Russia did not manage to do what it wanted in terms of energy outage. And that's because in the last years we've managed to build a system that can repulse the enemy's attacks, and that's because of the international community, of the support of the international community. Now Ukraine is showing that it can repulse the attacks of the enemy in a decent way, and even mount the attacks towards Russia.
With Ukrainian cyber forces going on the offense now, what sort of infrastructure do you think you'd be targeting?
Україна на сьогоднішній день не веде.
Ukraine right now is not mounting coordinating attacks towards Russia, but cyber activists around the world, from around the world and from Ukraine, are doing that, and privately. And from the beginning of the war, we had 4,000 activists in the that engaged in cyber warfare from around the world and from Ukraine as well, because they reacted to the Russian attack and targeted Russian infrastructure and even military logistics. But that was a private wish of people, of individuals.
With the officially sanctioned offensives mostly being targeted Russian troops and infrastructure inside occupied territory, what sorts of infrastructure are you actually going after? Is it communications? Is it power? Is it intel? What are the main targets here?
Тимчасово окуповані території – це території України, ми вживаємо всіх...
Temporary occupied territories are Ukraine, and we make all the necessary measures to defend the citizens and to free the territories as soon as possible, including to free the territories from the communication that's provided by the enemy, by the occupiers. Recently, we've implemented regulatory acts that make possible the defense of the temporary occupied territories in terms of defending them from the telephone connection Russia provides, including some communication tools and systems that Russia is illegally implementing, because we need to defend Ukrainian infrastructure, critical Ukrainian infrastructure on those territories. So we make everything that's in our power to defend the infrastructure and the citizens.
So the Ukrainian military is working and getting support from other nations at the moment, and particularly in the cyber front, whether it be nations like Poland or Slovakia that you've signed cybersecurity declarations with, or the US providing operational assistance and resources as well as support. Can you take us through what sort of help you are receiving at the moment and what sort of help you would like to receive in the future?
Ця кібервійна, яка на сьогодні йде в Україні, показала,
This cyber warfare showed that it can be stood up against only with the help of the international community. So we are cooperating not only with Poland and Slovakia, but also with the USA, the UK, France, Denmark, etc. And the majority of these cooperations started after the 14th of January. And we receive from them technical support towards making the data secure and towards the cybersecurity systems, towards making the cybersecurity systems work. Ukraine is now at the forefront, not only of the war on the ground, but also in the cyberspace, and all the whole world sees it as it is. That if Ukraine falls on the ground and if Ukraine falls in the cyberspace, it will mean disastrous consequences for other countries. So we need support and we need to resist. Right now, the most important is to gather indicators of the attacks, and we collaborate with other countries at which the attacks are aimed, the countries that support Ukraine, for example, the US. And we share our experience, we share knowledge.
So we know you have international assistance in your corner, but are you seeing a similar thing on the other side? Are you seeing other nations involved in the cyber war here in Ukraine? Are nations like China or North Korea or Belarus also in this domain fighting on behalf of Russia?
Білорусь і Росію ми розцінюємо як єдиний спільний фронт.
We consider Russia and Belarus as one front. Belarus is used for rocket strikes. The rocket strikes are made from the territory of Belarus. And in Belarus, Russian troops and planes are positioned. As for China, Iran, North Korea, etc., yes, we have some attacks from these countries, but we don't have evidence that these are coordinated attacks and that the hackers that are doing that are sanctioned from the state. Because there are hackers that mountain attacks in the commercial space. Market spaces are used for cyber attacks, but it is likely not the politics of the state.
We just saw the 6th-month anniversary of Russia launching their large February offensive into Ukraine. And we know Russia has been launching cyber attacks on Ukraine this entire time. But how do the attacks launched in February compare to the attacks we're seeing today?
Спочатку кіберагресія.
From the start of the war, we have recorded around 1,500 attacks on the Ukrainian infrastructure. The most powerful attacks were at the start of the war when they had time to prepare for them, but these attacks were repulsed by our cybersecurity services systems. And right now, the intensity of the attacks is the same, but the quality of them is much lesser because they don't have time anymore for preparation. And they also don't have time for defending Russian infrastructure in Russia, because as our experience showed us, they are not as protected as we had thought or as they had told us.
Are Russia launching their cyber attacks as the main thrust of these offensives in cities like Kherson or Kramatorsk, or have the attacks been playing more of a reactionary role to the main strike force's moves?
Координація атак. Ми прослідковували певні
We saw the coordination of the attacks and we identified certain behavior that Russia uses, and Russia coordinates rocket strikes and attacks towards the public authorities and the civilian authorities that govern. The goal of these attacks is to make the public panic. And if, for example, if people don't get immediate messages after strikes, it's good for the enemy, whose goal is to disrupt the trust of the public.
So when it comes to the cyber domain, what are your force's main goals here? What will be the targets going forward?
За результатом цієї війни на суходолі і в кібер.
As a result of this war on the ground and in the cyberspace, we hope to achieve victory. And the result of this war should be a unified world cybersecurity system. And we hope that this kind of system will cast Russia into the Stone Age, and that right now we witness that the majority of cybersecurity companies are leaving Russia or have left Russia, and we've got only a few months until companies in Russia will not be able to upgrade or get the hardware they need to function. We want to separate Russia from the civilized world and make it impossible for any country to mount massive cyber attacks to inflict damage on civilian infrastructures, because civilians should not be targeted and should not suffer because of cyber attacks. Russia is a strong opponent. It is not wise to undervalue Russia's skills, especially in the cyberspace. But thanks to the international community, thanks to our State Service of Special Communication and other organizations, we have managed to repulse the attacks.
Cyber warfare during peacetime is mostly used to hack emails and attack infrastructure, as well as launch ransomware upon your opponent. But on the battlefield, it has a very different use. Sometimes it's used for jamming communications, making it difficult to coordinate troops and attacks, and other times it's used to gather data on where your enemy troops are. In addition, sometimes it's used to shower the other side with propaganda. But as much as we understand the concepts, operationally, how are these attacks carried out? And how successful have they been so far in this war? Is cyber warfare the new tip of the spear, or just the weapon you use when you aren't allowed to use tanks? Well, to answer that, we turn to our third guest.
Part 3, where the rubber meets the road.
It was probably less that, we overestimated Russian capabilities than that we broadly overestimate how those capabilities can be incorporated into conventional warfare. All of the constraints of timing and control and impact that come into play when you've got conventional warfare happening alongside a lot of these operations simply don't lend themselves well the same way as during, quote unquote peacetime.
Gavin Wilde is a senior fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, specializing on Russia and information warfare, as well as examining the strategic challenges posed by cyber and influence operations. Previously, Wilde also served on the National Security Council as a director for Russia, Baltic and Caucasus affairs, and in addition to managing country-specific portfolios, he also focused on formulating and coordinating foreign malign influence, election security, and cyber policies. Wilde also served as a senior analyst in leadership roles at the National Security Agency and served as a linguist in the Federal Bureau of Investigation for over a decade. So we're absolutely thrilled to have him on the show today.
Some of what we saw was to be expected. A lot of these wiper attacks, a lot of efforts against critical communications infrastructure. But all that said, I think it would be important to remember that much of what appears to have been the Kremlin's grand plan was a quick decapitation operation and to kind of impose a puppet regime after a quick and easy bout of armed conflict. So I think there was an element of their effort that to make sure they didn't break what they were about to buy, essentially. And so I think that's perhaps why you saw less of that. But I think there's also a universe in which, with the imperatives of a conventional war, you needed to throw a lot of cyber capability that perhaps they just didn't have on hand in the timeframes that were given them. And certainly I think some of the bureaucratic rivalries and competition for talent between the military, the GRU, the FSB, the SVR, I think you're certainly seeing that, the well that they could go to for highly impactful offensive cyber capabilities may have simply not been as deep as we assumed it might have been.
I understand the Russian logic of holding back the really destructive cyber attacks in the early stages of this conflict. From the reports we have available, it seems like the Russians thought they would be able to put in a puppet government fairly quickly. And as everyone knows, you don't smash the windshield of a car you're about to steal. But now that Russia knows the quick installation of puppet government is effectively off the table, how has their cyber strategy changed?
So I think the important thing to remember from the US, or maybe the broader Western perspective about offensive cyber capabilities, is that we are very heavily indexed on the technical. And I take this back kind of to the 90s, when a lot of the thinking around the quote unquote CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we were thinking about cyber in terms of networks and the integrity of networks and data transmission. That's not really how Moscow and Russia, that was not the center of their thinking about, cyber issues. They thought about it in much more holistic terms, really starting more with the human psyche than with network integrity. And the reason for that, I think they looked at what happened certainly in their military campaigns against separatists in Chechnya in the mid 90s. They looked at U.S. operations against Kosovo in the late 90s, and they saw that local sentiment as well as global public sentiment, that was really the battle space that they saw that Russia would quickly run into trouble, both from a domestic perspective. Obviously, this is something that then President Boris Yeltsin wrestled with, is public sentiment when they're seeing all the brutality on television with what's happening in Chechnya. And then they saw kind of global public sentiment turning against Serbian leaders and the atrocities in Kosovo. And so they really think about this from the cognitive out in the same way as, the US and the West thinks about this as the network out. And so I think maybe some of that unmet expectation was due to the fact that Russia has probably relatively invested heavily in the cognitive and perception management and information operations side of the cyber coin, as it were, because they think in terms of the technical and the psychological as kind of two sides of the same coin. And they very well may have, for the purposes of this conflict in Ukraine, they very well may have simply over-indexed on the cognitive. And from what I can see, there's just not much evidence that it's actually working in their favor. There's studies out of Cambridge where even within occupied territories in Donbass, public sentiment is not necessarily sympathetic to a lot of the narratives that the Kremlin has tried to push over, certainly since 2014, about Novorossiya and all of these different projects. And so I think, especially now that, post 2016, that the Western technology companies and social media platforms and civil society have become really wise to the trade craft, and some of these local targeted populations are kind of immune and inoculated against some of these tactics by these cutouts and proxies of the GRU or the FSB. They simply may have put a lot of their eggs in the cognitive basket, and so when it came to the really sophisticated technical side, everybody might have been looking to the GRU, and the GRU may have kind of, at this point in the war, could have been standing there empty-handed with not much else to offer. And so, again, I'm not sure. There's so much that's unknowable here, but I think we should allow ourselves the possibility that the well has maybe run dry.
What about Russia's information troops? What can you tell us about them and their impact on this conflict so far?
The information troops that were stood up sometime around 2017 and conceptualized just a few years prior to that, they're still in their relative infancy. I mean, when you think about it, they're kind of thought of as a rough analog to US Cyber Command, but these information troops units are probably still in their relative infancy. There's some reports that they were used for the 2016 military exercises in Russia's southwest, but it kind of remains to be seen the degree to which they have proven a capable fighting force, able to interact in kind of a combined arms way in any conflict. And if, aside from the GRU, it remains to be seen whether these information troops have made a showing. Are they active? If they are, what value add do they bring? But from what I can read, a lot of the impetus behind even the stand-up of the information troops, the fact of them kind of being a rough analog to the Cyber Command or GCHQ notwithstanding, some of the initial thinking about the need for an information troops under the military umbrella was much more about having a counter-propaganda apparatus. There was not really much about an offensive cyber capability in the way that we were probably expecting to see in Ukraine.
An area I spent a lot of time studying and looking into is Central Asia, and there was an interesting trend unfolding in the region I'd like to ask you about. In the early stages of this offensive, we saw Russian propaganda in these regions being really overt, pressing their message on conventional platforms, megaphoning this is an internal issue between Russia and Ukraine, not the world. No one else should be involved or worried about it. But around the end of the first month, going into April, there seemed to be a bit of a shift in how the propaganda was being rolled out, and a kind of giving up, with the Russians instead moving their efforts towards either hyper-targeting specific people or propagandizing to really niche, often far left or far right groups, or moving most of their efforts towards the local Telegram, WhatsApp, WeChat or VK message groups. So why do you think the Kremlin made this move? Was it a deliberate more bang for your buck strategy, or was it just an adaptation as stations like RT were taken off air in many countries?
That's a great question. I think there is it's certainly possible that they're realizing that you're in this era now when they've been so thoroughly exposed across the board, not only in the digital space, but certainly, some of these assassination squads, et cetera, across Europe that have really been subject to the worst that, Bellingcat and some of the Western intelligence services can throw at them. I do wonder whether they've reached this point where you're not really going to find any new converts. The best you can do is simply kind of consolidate your gains among those who are already sympathetic towards your cause. I think that's certainly perhaps what we might be seeing in the so-called global South, where some of the propagandists had a little bit, had a more permissive environment in which to operate. But as far as kind of the covertness or the clandestinity of their operations, I don't know the degree to which that's merely, that's part of a grander strategy, or whether that's simply a byproduct of inertia. That's a great question.
Many members of the Ukrainian military have openly stated they would like to see a lot more cyber attacks being carried out by themselves or their Western allies at the infrastructure inside Russia. Although even with cyber being so hard to definitively attribute, most of the attacks carried out are seemingly taking place within the boundaries of Ukraine. What is stopping the West from carrying out larger cyber attacks against the Russian infrastructure? Is it that there's a desire not to escalate the situation, or is there a worry about galvanizing the Russian public, or is it that cyber defenses within Russia are much stronger than those within the recently taken territory in Ukraine?
I think particularly amidst a conventional armed conflict, you're going to have a lot of certainly lawyers within any government agency kind of scratching their heads about the law of armed conflict and international humanitarian law that comes into play in a really unique way right now. Certainly when we're seeing what's happening with the IT cyber army of Ukraine and Anonymous and Killnet and some of these hacktivist collectives that are fighting, if not on direct behalf of, at least with the tacit endorsement of their host governments, or oftentimes with targeting information being fed to them directly from the government, kind of out in the open in the case of the IT cyber army of Ukraine. It does pose a lot of very thorny issues, not only about who is considered a combatant in the legal sense, but then in the event that there is some kind of piece of critical infrastructure that is hit either intentionally or inadvertently, and there's backlash or ramification or counteroffensive in cyberspace, that becomes a very difficult issue from a geopolitical perspective. And as we've seen from Lloyd's of London and other cyber insurers, it gets even more thorny when it comes down to how do you insure against those types of operations that hit your critical infrastructure or your business community. And so my sense, at least, is that there's going to be a lot of folks that are probably thinking very hard before big splashy showings that critical infrastructure can be held at risk while this armed conflict is going on in Ukraine. One hopes that this conflict may galvanize a little bit more progress in that arena, but I think if anything, we're in for more fog, not less, as regards kind of who is who in the zoo as far as cyber combatants in the context of a broader war.
There are a number of think pieces coming out at the moment with the opinion that, well, this conflict has shown us that the cyber warfare is great, but still pales in comparison to the usefulness of conventional forces, that it's more of a peacetime weapon. What would you say to that?
I think that's broadly on point. I would kind of describe myself as someone who's a little bit more sympathetic to the skeptical side of the academic writing on cyber conflict. All that being said, sometimes it does really boil down to kind of a debate about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But I would say in general, I see a lot of this cyber activity as more an extension of an intelligence or counterintelligence or political warfare and subversion, more an expansion of that sphere than I do necessarily that cyber is a natural expansion of the conventional warfighting sphere, because again, I think it just suffers from too many of the limitations around timing and efficacy and degree of wieldability amidst bombs falling and shots being fired. But all of that said, that I think there's still room for that to be proven catastrophically wrong in coming days. So I offer it with that caveat always, because you certainly never know what's coming.
One of the major blows to Russia here was that the big private social media and software companies like Facebook and Microsoft have begun cracking down on Russian disinformation, deplatforming a lot of Russia's megaphones. So firstly, why do you think these private companies have chosen to take a side here, where traditionally companies like Facebook tend to stay neutral in these sort of conflicts? And how much of an impact do you think this has had on Moscow's disinformational reach?
I think in a lot of ways, certainly in Eastern Europe, those countries are in a lot of ways far ahead of where the US and the rest of the transatlantic community probably started on disinformation, in that they understood that this was kind of a societal level problem, that this wasn't something for which there would be a ready technological fix, that content moderation would only get you so far. I think one of the best things that the United States had at its disposal that it could kind of pre-bunk, if you will, the narratives coming out of the Kremlin. And I think the same goes for the tech companies and the social media platforms. So my hat is off to them when they certainly share some of those insights and lean forward and give the rest of the community an opportunity to weigh some of the evidence for themselves and see some of the perfidy up close and personal that's coming out of the Kremlin. If they can't win the battle in public opinion, in the court of public opinion, if they can't win that battle, they will certainly just settle for confusion. And I think that's where their disinformation operations have kind of evolved over the past, half decade or decade of certainly post, the MH17 shoot down. They're really beyond trying to convince anyone of anything, and it's more just trying to shoot enough chaff into the information ecosystem that people start to question whether there's anything that's believable in the first place. The good news is I think that that is counterproductive to their interests in the long term. But I think it creates opportunities certainly for the United States and the West and a lot of stakeholders who certainly in the private sector who operate on public credibility to kind of demonstrate their value by kind of pre-bunking and participating in a healthier information ecosystem and showing that there's an alternative to that really cynical approach.
It's all well and good for these companies to pull out of Russia and stop taking Russian money for advertising. Russia isn't that big a market. Again, its GDP is roughly the size of Australia's, and we aren't a global superpower by any stretch of the imagination. But what do you think would happen if China carried out a similar invasion on Taiwan, for example? Are the same companies in the future likely to be as bold and pull all of their materials and investments out of China in response to Chinese aggression? Or will the size of the Chinese market for these products simply make it too painful to these companies like Microsoft or Meta to take a similar stance of a Chinese aggression that they've been able to take over Russian aggression?
One would certainly hope, but that again goes back to my kind of question of how replicable this was, or how replicable this would be in a different conflict or different context. A lot of the kind of self-selection out of the Russian market was less, to my eye, the sanctions regime, and more some terrible catastrophe that creates an inflection point where companies really have to question what they stand for from a not only geopolitical perspective, but from a moral perspective. And that's where I see some real value in the conversations around ESG that the corporate world's kind of come around on in the past few years of it's very difficult to claim neutrality in these types of situations. All that said, we've known about the atrocities we've known about a lot of atrocities in Xinjiang province and, human rights abuses in a lot of markets that simply has not had the effect that one would hope for companies to kind of say, hey, we're not going to be a part of this. That's a long way of saying I'm not sure that we would see the same kind of exodus from the Chinese market in the event of a clash with Taiwan.
Do you think that a lot of countries are taking notes on how cyber warfare is being carried out here, and there may be a lot of restructuring of their cyber capabilities after this war, taking into account what they've seen work and not work within the Ukrainian battle space?
I think it does raise very fundamental questions about the degree to which cyber can be incorporated into combined arms without very clear doctrines, very clear kind of order of battle. One of the major lessons it says to me, the Russians didn't follow a lot of what they had written down. Their planning was clearly pretty tightly held and slipshod. Their delegation of, operational authority downward was almost non-existent. And so, if anything, I think it reinforced the degree to which if you're going to try to incorporate cyber effects in a combined arms campaign, there's certainly a lot of characteristics that absolutely have to be in place as far as your command structure.
Whilst it's the generals in Ukraine and Russia pushing the pieces around the board, the entire rest of the world is watching with bated breath, taking down every single note of what's happening here in the cyber domain. We can see the impact this conflict's having on countries' decision making, with things like the success of the Turkish Bayraktar drones. At the start of the war, they were seen as an alright drone, but now have proven themselves to be some of the best bang for your buck, with countries across the globe placing orders for fleets of them. So will we see other countries taking note of the cyber domain here? Will we see China taking away the notes that their first cyber strikes against Taiwan need to be devastating? Will we see the US speculate that cyber defense was a huge build-up for very little payoff? And will we see private companies be ready for when the next war breaks out somewhere in the globe? Well, to answer that, we'll turn to our final guest.
Part 4. A painful connection.
You can explain Russia's poor performance using cyber tools with two things. First, the Russians just did a terrible job planning. They thought this was they believed their own propaganda, which is always a mistake, and thought this was going to be a stroll in the park. They'd be welcomed with open arms. Boy, we could have told them that almost never happens. So they didn't put a lot of effort into planning. You know, if you think you're going to own something in 2 weeks, you're not going to break it. The second thing is the Ukrainians learned from earlier Russian attacks, particularly in 2014 on critical infrastructure. The Russians have been poking at the Ukrainians for years, and they were able to cobble together a fairly strong defense. And so Ukraine shows us that defense can be superior to offense in cyber warfare if you do the right things. So I think it's those two things: bad planning on the Russian side, strong Ukrainian defense.
James Lewis is the Vice President and Director of Strategic Studies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also previously a diplomat and a member of the Senior Executive Service with extensive negotiating, politico-military and regulatory experience, as well as a senior advisor for numerous UN groups of governmental experts, specializing in information security. On top of that, he's also part of the long-running two-track dialogue with the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, and an expert on the development of national cyber doctrines. And we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
No, the Russians made a massive effort. So denial of service barely counts as an attack. It's more like it's spray painting graffiti. But they went after critical infrastructure. They went after networks. We all know they went after satellite terminals. They went after government agencies, ministries. So it was a broad, although uncoordinated attack using advanced cyber tools that they had developed months in advance to attack the Ukrainians.
Most analysts watching this field have been worried about the potential of Russia unleashing a whole bunch of zero-day vulnerabilities. If you want a really deep dive on what these are, go check out our full cyber warfare piece. But to oversimplify very quickly, zero-day vulnerabilities are kind of like little worms, where a country would find a vulnerability in their enemy system and plant this little worm. These worms then sit in the system for ages, dormant, unknown to your enemy. Then when you do want to launch your attack, you tell these worms that have been sitting there for ages to all wake up at once and carry out their attacks. So many assume Russia had a bunch of zero-day vulnerabilities in the Ukrainian system that had not been discovered yet, but we haven't seen any of the impacts that we assume something like this would cause. So in your opinion, did the Ukrainians manage to clean them all up before the Russians got a chance to use them, or did Russia never get them in? Or is Russia still saving them for another day, as you really only get one shot to use these as a surprise weapon? Because once you launch them and the other side stabilizes everything, they then get to patch them out. So you really only get one shot with these things. What do you think the likely scenario here is?
The Russians kind of tipped their hand with their earlier attacks. And so the Ukrainians had thought a little bit about what they needed to be prepared to do. And I think the biggest things that the Ukrainians gave the Ukrainians an advantage were they, with the help of some external parties, both in the private sector and a couple of governments, did a good job of monitoring Russian cyber attacks and identifying them as they came in within a few hours. Second, they had thought a lot about how to distribute the services they used. And so using cloud, putting data and services outside of Ukraine. That turned out to be very useful. And the Russians have been unwilling to go after, for obvious, despite all their bellicose rhetoric, they're not going to attack the big cloud providers who are mainly American. And third, the Ukrainians reacted quickly. And that's probably the most important lesson here is monitor, identify, and react quickly so that they were able to, with help, again, from a couple governments, including Estonia, which ought to know how to deal with the Russians, they were able to react quickly and shut down attacks before they'd done too much damage. Off the top of my head, a guess would be, and this is anecdotal, would be usually within 2 or 3 hours. And in the real world, in the peacetime, companies can go for months before they realize they've been hacked. The Ukrainians did a much better job.
So we know the Ukraine has countries like Estonia and the United States and Poland all backing them and fighting on their side in the cyber conflict here. But what sort of operations has the EU been carrying out? How influential have other countries been within this conflict?
They're not fighting a cyber war. They're helping because they're not attacking. And so we haven't seen, every once in a while people at Cyber Command make noises about how they're defending forward or something. I don't think that's right. Because we haven't seen the Russians particularly knocked off balance by any attack. But you've got companies helping the Ukrainians identify Russian attacks and respond quickly to them. And that includes not just the US, but also the UK, which has exceptional cyber capabilities. And I'm told the Dutch, who also have very strong cyber capabilities, have helped. And of course, the Estonians have been pretty frank about it. They've, ever since the Russians poked them, 15 years ago, they've put a lot of effort into this. So those 4 countries alone give you a big advantage. And there might be others, some of the Scandinavian countries who also have strong cyber capabilities may have helped, but it's a pretty good suite of allies there for the Ukrainians.
And are the EU or Estonia keeping their operations to within Ukrainian borders, or are they starting to go after Russian infrastructure within the Russian Republic?
It appears to me that the Ukrainians have gone after Russian information resources. No one has attacked Russian critical infrastructure, right? So that's one of the problems we have with cyber warfare is in 1998, the US put out a presidential directive, PDD 63, that talked about how cyber attacks would attack critical infrastructure, sort of like a proxy kinetic weapon. And a lot of times we still think like it was 1998, and it's not, right? So you would want to go after the data resources, the information resources, the network resources, more than the actual infrastructures for electricity or water. We haven't seen that, but I think the Ukrainians have been very active. I don't know how successful, but very active in cyber espionage, in interfering with some of the Russian activities. So it's a different kind of war than maybe what people have expected.
So some people pointed to Russia's recent disconnection from the wider internet and the nation's building of its own intranet, which that intranet then connects to the American-led internet. Did this end up being a major protection for the Russians from outside attacks, or is that not really what it's designed to do, and it's more useful for shaping Russian internal discourse in times of riot or trouble?
Oh, I love the disconnected internet one because it's never true. And so there's always some connection, right? There's always some way in. Unless, if you're North Korea, you can be disconnected. Even they are a little connected because that means no international phone calls, no connections to the global financial system, nothing for businesses that now rely entirely on cloud and internet. So of course the Russians have tons of connections. I mean, they've done a fairly good job of cutting out Western information sources, alternate narratives, not as good as the Chinese, but they're not disconnected. I mean, people say stuff like that. it's always when someone tells you they're disconnected from the internet, that usually means they're vulnerable.
Now that we're 6 months into this stage of the conflict, are you seeing the Russians starting to shift their cyber doctrines and try new strategies in the field?
The Russians have done a couple things with mixed success. In the places they've taken over, they've been able to reconfigure the internet and telecom connections so that it's no longer a Ukrainian system, it's part of Russia. And that gives them a little bit of an advantage. They've made an effort to engage. And one of the interesting things about this war is you're seeing a blend of cyber, electronic warfare, information warfare. It doesn't fit well into the boxes we created years ago, right? So the Russians have an electronic warfare system that has drones. It's a vehicle. It comes with, I think, 4 drones. The drones are, I don't know if people may not know what a Stinger is, but a Stinger is basically a device that emulates a cell phone tower. So when you call on your phone, instead of connecting with the cell phone, the real cell phone tower, you connect with this proxy device. And that, of course, gives the person who's owning the device access to your content and the ability to monitor calls, the ability to inject calls. So the Russians have this EW system that includes drones that capture telecom, that act as like flying cell phone towers. And they use it to send messages to Ukrainian troops. Don't know how effective it is, probably not very effective. They have blended EW and cyber. Not very well, but they're at least making an effort. And I think that's the biggest change, is they've realized they're going to need to get control of the networks. And controlling the networks is important because one of the changes in this war is, and this is actually what I'm doing research on, everybody is an intelligence collector. If you have a mobile phone, you can be an intelligence collector. It's kind of annoying because it's not, you don't need, the US used to spend billions of dollars on what they would call exquisite capabilities to collect imagery and signals. And now you can do it with your darn $100 cell phone, right? It's got sensors on it, it's got a camera. You can probably get an internet connection that might let you use some of the programs that let you listen into mobile calls. One of the reasons to think about how the Russians were put at a disadvantage is they weren't expecting this kind of broad resistance, broad intelligence collection. And they don't really know how to manage it. But one way you could manage it is by taking control of the internet connections to send them through Russia, by jamming or interfering with mobile signals, or by creating these sort of false cell phone towers as a way to do it. So they're struggling. It's like, if you wanted a sort of cheap and not perfect example, in the 1973 war where the Syrians and the Egyptians invaded Israel, there was a shock to the world because they had Russian anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, and the Israelis were unprepared for that. We were unprepared for it, right? And so the Russians were unprepared for this new kind of intelligence activity that the Ukrainians have done so well in. The Ukrainians thought in advance, it looks to me. It looks like they thought about how do you just kind of have everybody calling on their phone and saying, hey, I saw a tank, right? Because how do you collate that? How do you prioritize it? How do you assign resources to hit the target? You have to have thought about that in advance. And the Ukrainians have done pretty well. And I think the Russians are trying to figure out now, how do we deal with this environment that is different from any war that has ever been seen?
In the early stages of the war, particularly anonymous message boards and places like 4chan, there was a lot of talk of groups like Anonymous, as an example, banding together to crash the Russians as a lot of private citizens. Did these freelance or amateur groups actually make much of an impact on the conflict?
No, it's ridiculous. They don't have any real capabilities. And so one of the problems in general for cyber conflict is that it's a domain of war, and it's also a domain of public relations. So everyone, including some big companies, make these statements that we will do X, we will do Y, we will do Z. And what I always do is take a step back and say, okay, show me the effect. If you can't find this is the old, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it count? The answer is, in this case, no. There's no effect. And so Anonymous made a number of noisy threats. Disrupting the Duma, the Russian parliament's website, for a couple of hours is not going to bring Russia closer to victory. It's not going to bring Russia closer to defeat. So that's the metric you want to use. Does this bring me closer to victory? Otherwise, it's irrelevant. And that's where most of these civil actors, actually all of these civil actors, fall, except the intelligence collectors in Ukraine. Amazing stuff. There's a program called WebSDR, Software Defined Radio, that lets you listen in over the internet to mobile phone communications. That is where you have a lot of these civil actors listening into. This is where we've gotten some of the data on the Russians complaining about how bad, the Russian troops complaining about how bad things are. But in terms of denial of service attack, who cares, right? It's not going to move you 1 inch closer to taking over Kiev.
Quite famously, the Russians also built their own version of GPS called GLONASS. And many speculated that by jamming the Russian connection between themselves and GLONASS, tanks and planes would be in major trouble, being not able to navigate anymore. Did people actually manage to jam the connection to GLONASS? And if jammed, was it the Achilles heel in the Russian army that everyone thought it would be?
There was a picture of a Russian combat aircraft where the pilot had taped a GPS receiver to the front of the cockpit. So I'm not sure that bringing down GLONASS it's not a bad idea. It's certainly, if we got into a fight with the Russians or the Chinese, they would go after GPS. But putting aside the technical difficulties of disrupting GLONASS, and I presume it would be on the terrestrial end, not in space. I'm not sure what benefit you get. Because you have Baidu, you have GPS, the Russians probably could do well enough. I don't know how well their weapons, their PGMs are dependent on GLONASS signals. My suspicion is that most people use multiple signals. So, you fire a missile and it uses GLONASS, but it might default to GPS if GLONASS is disrupted. But the Russians are running out of PGMs anyhow. And, these are sort of peripheral solutions. It might have been a good idea to disrupt navigation services at the onset of the conflict, but right now it's not that useful.
We learned a lot about the Russian capabilities from their previous attacks into Estonia, Ukraine, and Central Asia. But does China also try these kind of probing attacks? I mean, the other day we did see China launch a whole flurry of DDoS attacks against Taiwan during the recent visit from Pelosi. But what can we learn from that? And what can we learn from other Chinese cyber attacks toward enemies like Taiwan?
The balance here is always between attack and espionage. And DDoS is the amateur hour. DDoS is like spray painting rude slogans on the outside of a building. And so it doesn't really have that much effect against a prepared opponent, right? So I don't worry about DDoS. But the Chinese, like everyone, do the balance between the benefits of espionage, using cyber espionage to collect information, and the benefit of disruption, using cyber activities to disrupt opponent systems. And they are maxed out on the espionage side. I don't know precisely, but I would not be surprised to think they had stupendous access in Taiwan. And that means they, at some point, can decide to switch from I'm in the mode of collecting information to I'm in the mode of disrupting services. The Chinese have improved markedly in say, the last 20 years. And they've gone from being noisy collectors of economic information to much quieter and more skillful collectors of national security information. So I wouldn't underestimate the Chinese. I mean, we can think about what do the Ukrainians do, and can Taiwan do that to defend itself against Chinese cyber attacks? Short answer, yes. One part that doesn't come out is like the move to the cloud. So you're a Taiwanese business and you have some of your most valuable data and some of your most valuable software tools in the cloud. And the cloud could mean a data center in California, in Japan, in Singapore, right? And so that complicates the attacker's task because they say, I want to attack Taiwan, but do I want to get in a war with Japan, the US, and Singapore? Probably not. And that's the Russians have run into this problem, is that they have been unwilling to cross the territorial borders of Ukraine and attack cyber targets outside of those borders. The Chinese will have the same problem. If the Taiwanese are smart, I'm sure the big sophisticated Taiwanese tech companies have a lot of their stuff in the cloud, just because that's what businesses do now. And that makes them a much harder target.
So do you think at any stage in this conflict, the Russians might decide to go over the border and start launching cyber attacks against infrastructure inside Poland or Slovakia or Romania? Or frankly, Russia knows that may open a can of worms and is not looking to escalate this any further?
That's an interesting question because NATO has been debating this for 15 years. And so, Estonia was a NATO member. Russia used fairly primitive denial of service attacks against Estonia in 2007. It was when they moved a large and rather ugly Russian soldier's statue out of the center of the city. And I just saw in the paper that the Estonians are again moving Russian memorials to their wonderfulness. And so I hope that doesn't mean the start of another conflict. But what the Estonians did was they called NATO up and said, hey, we're under cyber attack. What do you do? And NATO said in 2007, I don't know. And so we've had a 15-year discussion that's made progress. NATO is in much better shape because a cyber attack could trigger Article 5, the collective self-defense provision. So if you attack the power grid in Poland and NATO decides, yes, this qualifies as an actual attack that triggers Article 5, you're not just attacking Poland, you're attacking all of the countries in NATO. And the Russians are obsessed with NATO, but they're probably uncertain about launching an attack on a NATO member. A real denial of service isn't going to scare anyone. But if they disrupted critical infrastructure, does that cross the line? Does it come too close to the line? The Russians are uncertain, and that's a good thing.
So to bring this interview to a bit of a close, what do you think are the major lessons that the West will take away from this conflict? What have we learned over the last 6 months? And are these lessons going to be applicable for future conflicts between other major powers, like if China were to go to war with Taiwan? What is your big takeaway from all of this?
3 things leap out at me. The first is, actually 4. The first is you need to go to full-scale monitoring. Hard to do in a big country like the US or China because you have thousands of targets. The smaller countries, you maybe have a few dozen, but you need to monitor those networks, right? And there's civil liberty implications that would get suspended in a war, that you would let the big private actors that do monitoring play a larger role, or you would let governments play a larger role. You have to watch what's happening on your networks. The second thing we've learned is you have to respond immediately, right? You have to respond to block the attack, to undo the damage, to remove the hostile software. Ukraine has done good at that. We would need to have that same capability. The third is you need to think about your, geeky term, data architecture. Where does your data get stored, right? Is it vulnerable? And for a big country like China or the US, this may not be as much of an issue, but for a small country, really anyone who's not that sort of continental sized power, have a cloud service provider and have your data stored in another country, and that complicates the attacker's task. And finally, think about how you coordinate the civil resistance, because that's been so effective in both monitoring Russian activity, in countering Russian propaganda, in giving the Ukrainians an intelligence advantage. So there's 4 things that I hope we learn from, and there are things that we could do. You'll notice I didn't use the word deterrence. We're not deterring anybody in cyberspace, but we can make defense better so it has an advantage over an attacker. And hopefully some of the attackers, the Russians and the Chinese, will have figured that out.
So the war stands at a pivotal crossroad, where neither side is in a position to make that knockout punch, and winter is right around the corner. And as the Mongols and Napoleon or Hitler will tell you, winter in Ukraine makes fighting a bloody muddy mess. Moscow may be hoping that everyone settles in, and this just becomes the de facto borderlines, much like the ceasefire at the end of 2014 or the end of the Transnistrian War, which gave us the de facto borders today. Others will say that this winter will give both sides a chance to catch their breath and prepare for another big swing when the ground hardens up again. Regardless of what happens over that front, a lull in the fighting of a winter will bring about some soul-searching from both sides about their cyber warfare doctrines. Ukraine may take the time to formulate strategies to take the fight to Russia, how Ukraine can be interfering with crucial infrastructure inside Russia, or how Ukraine can release sensitive emails to further alienate the Russian elite from the perturbed population. Russia may take the time to actually come up with a decent cyber strategy, something actually targeted, as setting up a coordinated cyber attack takes a little more time than a Russian general planning an ad hoc tank thrust toward an important bridge. Although it won't be just these two taking time to evaluate the situation. The EU, the US, China are watching this theatre very closely. The US is learning firsthand the weaknesses within the Russian systems and gaining mountains of data on how to exploit those Russian systems, as well as the other nations like Kazakhstan and Belarus who share a lot of the same cyber architecture. The Chinese may be taking the data from Ukraine and look to recalibrate their cyber strategies, seeing how the Russians assumed they had done enough propagandic work where they actually believed the Ukrainians would likely turn away from any hard fight and put their guns on the ground. A similar sentiment toward Taiwan is shared by some Chinese cheerleaders. But this war on the staunch Ukrainian defense would probably give pause for thought with even the most fervent supporters. Many inside the Politburo may be asking if Beijing is under similar miscalculations in their thinking about Taiwan. Is their cyber strategy enough? Is it targeted in the right places? All we know is this will make waves within the Chinese doctrines. As I once had told to me, to understand the pivot points in tomorrow's war, you have to observe today's battlefield mistakes. Thank you so much for tuning into the show this week. We've wanted to do a piece on Ukraine for quite a while now, but it's been too big of a subject to do a single piece on. It's pretty hard to understate how important this moment will be. This moment in time will likely be geopolitically as shaping as Vietnam or the collapse of Yugoslavia. And there's just so much dust up in the air at the moment, to be able to accurately speculate where it all comes down is pretty difficult. What I think I'm trying to say is that we'll be certainly covering this theatre more in the future. After last week's episode on aircraft carriers, I had so many of you reach out to me via Twitter or my email with reviews, questions, and personal stories about aircraft carriers and the doctrines. And I absolutely loved it. I responded or had phone calls and great chats with a whole bunch of you, and I was shocked at the amount of messages we actually had come through. I absolutely love connecting and answering all the follow-up questions that so many of you had. And if you want to get in touch again or directly message me or leave your thoughts, you can find all the links and info on our Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok at the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you want to message me directly on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeEliteOz. Oz is in Australia. This show is completely funded by our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each week to help myself and the team keep this one going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this episode is dedicated to friend of the show, Chad Hansen, who is the latest patron to sign up or increase his donation at the time of recording. This show is only possible with the support of our listeners like Chad. So if you want to see this continue and you feel you could spare a couple of dollars, we'd very much appreciate it. But this episode on cyber war in Ukraine is once again thanks to you, Chad. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Sandworm, a new era of cyber warfare and the hunt for the Kremlin's most dangerous hackers by Andy Greenberg, for a look at the Russian cyber program. The second is Like a War, the weaponizing of social media by P.W. Singer, for a look at how forces like the GRU use social media to influence countries. And the third is Information Warfare in the Age of Cyber Conflict by Christopher White, on the doctrination coordination between branches of the military. I want to say thanks to this week's guests, Roman Osadchuk, Yurii Shchyhol, Gavin Wilde, and James Lewis. All of you are at the forefront of this issue, and we were amazed to be able to have you all on the panel this week. I also want to thank my staff, Webb McCarr, the producer, Perry Grace, Daniel Isabella, Isaac Gibbs, Andrew Garbery, and Robbie Sutton, our research assistants and writers, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Jamie Thanu, our media director, Ross Crabtree, our media advisor, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. I also want to say thanks to our new friend Layla, who did the translations between myself and Yurii. Without this team, there is no way we'd be able to pull stories off like this, and I'm incredibly thankful to have their help on this project. The Red Line will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. Until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.